Elizabeth Liz arrived at the old mansion just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sprawling estate. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses, but beneath the floral fragrance, Elizabeth detected a faint odor of decay. It was the kind of smell that hinted at something hidden, something lurking in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. Her client, Mr. Smith, greeted her at the front door, a gaunt figure with sunken eyes and a tremble in his voice. He led her through the grand foyer, which was adorned with marble columns and a sweeping staircase that curved upwards towards the second floor. "This way, Ms. Liz," he said, gesturing towards a dimly lit corridor. "The library is this way. I've already arranged for your accommodations to be set up in the adjacent guest room." Elizabeth followed him down the corridor, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She had been hired to investigate the history of the mansion, to uncover any secrets that had been buried for generations. It was a task that she relished, for Elizabeth had always been fascinated by the past and the stories it held. As they reached the library, Mr. Smith motioned for Elizabeth to enter, then closed the door behind her. The room was lined with shelves that towered to the ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes and dusty tomes. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Elizabeth took a deep breath, inhaling the musty scent of old books. She felt a sense of excitement and anticipation, for she knew that within these pages lay the key to unlocking the mysteries of the mansion. She approached one of the shelves and began to run her fingers over the spines, reading the titles and authors' names. The room was filled with the stories of generations past, each book a window into a different time and place. As she reached for a particularly worn volume, she heard a faint whispering sound coming from the darkness behind her. It was almost imperceptible, but it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Elizabeth shook her head and tried to focus on her work, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. She closed the book and stood up, feeling a sense of unease. That's when she heard it, a rustling sound coming from the shadows. "Hello," Elizabeth called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. There was no answer, but the rustling continued, growing louder and more frenzied. Suddenly, a gust of wind rushed through the room, causing the pages of the books to flutter and the candles to flicker. Elizabeth's heart raced as she realized that something was not right. She backed away slowly, her eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. That's when she saw it, a shadowy figure lurking in the corner of the room, watching her with glowing eyes. Elizabeth froze, her breath caught in her throat. She had never believed in ghosts, but now she was faced with undeniable proof of their existence. The figure moved closer, its ghostly form shimmering in the dim light. Elizabeth tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. The figure reached out to her, its cold fingers brushing against her cheek. And then it was gone, fading back into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. Elizabeth was left alone in the library, shaken to the core by her encounter with the supernatural. She stumbled out of the room, her mind reeling with questions. What was happening in this mansion, and why had she been chosen to uncover its secrets? Elizabeth knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to rest until she found out. She proceeded to confront Mr. Smith about what she had seen. Mr. Smith mentioned that he had recently inherited the mansion from his late father and that strange occurrences had been happening, becoming increasingly aggressive. He also mentioned for decades, the owner's wife would definitely pass away at a certain age and he wouldn't want it to happen to his wife. This was precisely why he had hired her, to uncover the mystery of the mansion. After hearing Mr. Smith's explanation, Elizabeth realized that she needed to do more research on the history of the mansion in the library. She mustered her courage and went back to it. Elizabeth sat in the dimly lit study, poring over old books and manuscripts. As she turned the pages of an ancient tome, her eyes fell upon the name Lady Arabella. Intrigued, she read on, her heart pounding with anticipation. Lady Arabella had been the mistress of the mansion, a beautiful and enigmatic woman who had captured the hearts of all who met her. But her beauty was also her curse, for she had attracted the attention of a powerful and jealous man. As Elizabeth read on, she learned that Lady Arabella had been accused of witchcraft by the townspeople. They had accused her of casting spells and consorting with demons, and had burned her at the stake in a frenzy of fear and superstition. Elizabeth felt a pang of sadness as she read about Lady Arabella's tragic fate. It was clear that she had been a victim of her own beauty, a woman who had been punished for the sins of others. But Elizabeth was determined to uncover the truth, to find out what really happened on that fateful day. She continued to read, her eyes growing heavy with fatigue. The night was dark and quiet, and the only sounds were the turning of pages and the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. As she read on, Elizabeth began to feel a sense of unease. It was as if someone was watching her, a presence that lingered just out of sight. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. But the feeling persisted, and she couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that had settled over her. She closed the book with a sigh and stood up, stretching her tired muscles. As she turned to leave the study, she heard a faint whisper in the darkness again. It was a sound that chilled her to the bone, a voice that seemed to come from beyond the grave. Elizabeth froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she was not alone in the mansion, and that the spirits of the past were watching her every move. With trembling hands, Elizabeth reached for the doorknob, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. She knew that the road ahead would be long and treacherous, but she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what the cost. For in the darkness of the mansion, there were whispers that echoed through the ages, and Elizabeth knew that she was destined to hear them all. Elizabeth could feel the presence growing stronger. It was no longer just a whisper in the dark, but a palpable force, lurking in the shadows of the mansion. She tried to rationalize her fear, to remind herself that she was a historian, a woman of science, and that ghosts were just the products of an overactive imagination. But as the night wore on, and the whispers grew louder, she found herself believing in the impossible. She paced the halls, her flashlight illuminating the dark corners of the mansion. She had locked all the doors, but it seemed as if the ghosts could pass through solid walls. She felt a chill run down her spine as she heard a faint tapping on the window. She approached it cautiously, peering out into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing but the swaying trees and the pale moonlight. But then she saw the outline of a figure, standing in the shadows. It was a woman, with long hair and flowing robes. Elizabeth gasped as the woman turned to face her, revealing a face twisted in rage and despair. It was Lady Arabella, the former mistress of the mansion, and she was not pleased to see Elizabeth there. Suddenly, the room was filled with a cold, eerie wind. Elizabeth shuddered as she felt the woman's ghostly hand brush against her cheek. She tried to run, but the doors were locked, and the windows were sealed shut. She was trapped, alone with the vengeful spirit of Lady Arabella. "Leave this place," the ghostly voice hissed, "or suffer the same fate as I." Elizabeth knew that she had to remain calm, that she couldn't let the ghost get the better of her. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. "I have a job to do, and I won't be scared off by a ghost." For a moment, there was silence. Elizabeth held her breath, waiting for Lady Arabella's response. And then, with a final, furious shriek, all the light bulbs exploded and the ghost disappeared, leaving Elizabeth alone once more. She stood there for a moment, catching her breath, before making her way back to her room. She knew that the ghost would be back, that the aggression was only beginning. But she was determined to see this investigation through, no matter what terrors lay in store. The next morning, Elizabeth decided to take the train to the nearby town. As she stepped off the train and onto the platform, her eyes scanning the small, run-down town ahead of her. This was the place where Lady Arabella's accusers had lived, and where their descendants still resided. The town was small and quiet, with dusty streets and run-down buildings. Elizabeth could feel the weight of history here. as though the past was still alive and well, haunting the present. As she walked down the main street, she noticed that the people who passed her by looked at her with suspicion and unease. She knew she was an outsider, an intruder in their town, and that they would not welcome her questions about their ancestors. Finally, she arrived at the home of the last living descendant of Lady Arabella's accusers. The house was small and cramped, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Elizabeth knocked on the door, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. A gruff voice answered from inside. "Who's there?" "Hello, my name is Elizabeth Blackwood," she replied, trying to sound confident. "I'm a historian, and I'm here to ask you about your ancestors and their role in the trial of Lady Arabella." There was a long pause before the door creaked open, revealing an old man with deep-set eyes and a scowl on his face. "We don't take kindly to outsiders around here," he growled. "What do you want to know?" Elizabeth took a deep breath and began to ask her questions, trying to be respectful but persistent. The man answered grudgingly, revealing snippets of information about his family's history and their involvement in the trial. She learned that the townspeople had been suspicious of Lady Arabella from the moment she arrived, seeing her as a threat to their way of life. They accused her of witchcraft and tried her in a sham trial, ignoring any evidence to the contrary. The man's voice grew angrier as he spoke, relishing in the past wrongs committed by his ancestors. Elizabeth could feel her stomach turning as she listened to the hatred and prejudice that still lingered in the town. Finally, she thanked the man for his time and turned to leave. As she walked back down the dusty street, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered inside her. She knew that the past was still alive here, haunting the present, and that she was getting closer to the truth behind Lady Arabella's death. But with each step she took, she also felt the weight of Lady Arabella's ghost pressing down on her, as though the vengeful spirit were watching her every move. She knew that her investigation was far from over, and that the ghost would stop at nothing to protect the secrets of the past. Elizabeth stood in front of the old courthouse, her mind racing with anticipation. She had spent the entire morning searching through dusty archives and ancient tomes, piecing together the story of Lady Arabella and her tragic fate. But there was still so much she didn't know, so much she needed to uncover. As she pushed open the courthouse door, the musty smell of old books and legal documents hit her. She approached the clerk's desk and asked for any information they might have on Lady Arabella's trial. The clerk disappeared into a back room and emerged a few moments later with a stack of yellowed papers. Elizabeth thanked him and settled into a nearby chair, ready to delve into the past. The trial records were detailed and gruesome. Lady Arabella had been accused of witchcraft by several townspeople, who claimed to have witnessed her communing with the devil and casting spells on the local crops. Elizabeth's heart sank as she read through the transcripts. The accusations were baseless and unfounded, fueled by superstition and fear. Lady Arabella had been a victim of the times, condemned by those who feared anything they couldn't understand. But as Elizabeth read on, a new name caught her eye. A man named Samuel Blackwood, Lady Arabella's former lover, had testified against her at the trial. He claimed to have seen her consorting with the devil, and even accused her of stealing his soul. Elizabeth's mind raced as she processed this information. Samuel Blackwood was a name she had heard before, but where? She furiously flipped through her notes, trying to remember where she had come across it. And then it hit her. Samuel Blackwood was the ancestor of her client, Mr. Smith. He was the reason why Lady Arabella's ghost was haunting the mansion, seeking revenge for her unjust death. Elizabeth felt a surge of anger and determination. She knew what she had to do. She would confront Mr. Smith and force him to confront the truth about his ancestors' actions. She would put Lady Arabella's spirit to rest, no matter the cost. As she left the courthouse, Elizabeth felt a newfound sense of purpose. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place, and she knew that the truth was within her grasp. She had come too far to give up now. The past may be dark and full of secrets, but Elizabeth was determined to uncover them all. Back to the mansion, Elizabeth's heart raced as she strode down the dimly lit hallway toward Mr. Smith's study. The mansion seemed to creak and groan around her, as if it too were trying to warn her away. Finally, she reached the study door and knocked sharply. "Mr. Smith, it's Elizabeth. May I come in?" There was a moment of silence before Mr. Smith's voice replied, "Of course, Elizabeth. Come in." Elizabeth pushed open the door and stepped inside. Mr. Smith was sitting behind a large wooden desk, his face grave. "Mr. Smith," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling slightly, "I know what happened to Lady Arabella. I know what your ancestor did." Mr. Smith looked up sharply, surprise written on his face. "What are you talking about?" Elizabeth took a deep breath and proceeded to inform Mr. Smith of everything she had uncovered during her research. She shared the disturbing truth about his ancestor's role in Lady Arabella's descent into madness, and how her tragic demise had been the result of being burned alive due to false accusations. As Elizabeth spoke, Mr. Smith's face grew paler and paler. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, looking shell-shocked. "I had no idea what my family was responsible for. I can't believe this was kept from me all these years." Elizabeth felt a surge of anger and determination. She knew what she had to do. She would force Mr. Smith to confront the truth about his family's past, and help put Lady Arabella's spirit to rest. "We have to do something," she said firmly. "We have to make this right. We have to find a way to help Lady Arabella's spirit find peace." Mr. Smith nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "Yes," he said softly. "Yes, we have to try. Now, I truly understand why 3 generations of owner's wife has died at the age of Lady Arabella when she was burned to death." Elizabeth stood in the center of the mansion's grand hall, surrounded by the looming shadows of Lady Arabella's ghost. The specter glared at her with empty eyes, a pale glow emanating from her translucent form. Elizabeth took a deep breath and summoned all her courage. She knew that she needed to confront Lady Arabella's ghost and uncover the truth behind her tragic fate. "Lady Arabella," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty hall. "I know what happened to you. I know who was responsible for your death." The ghostly figure hissed and advanced towards Elizabeth, her spectral form pulsing with anger. "You dare speak of that traitor?" Lady Arabella's voice echoed through the hall, a chilling reminder of the power she still held in death. "I do," Elizabeth said firmly, her eyes locked on the ghost. "I know that he was responsible for your death, and that his descendants still hold a grudge against you to this day." Lady Arabella's ghost seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if considering Elizabeth's words. "You speak the truth," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what can you do to right the wrongs of the past?" "I can put your spirit to rest," Elizabeth said, holding up the ancient tome that she had discovered in her research. "This book contains a powerful spell that can release you from this plane of existence and allow you to move on to the afterlife." Lady Arabella's ghost studied Elizabeth for a moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to trust her. "Very well," she finally said. "Perform the spell, and I will be released from this world." Elizabeth nodded and began to recite the incantation from the book. The words flowed from her lips like water, each syllable carrying the weight of centuries of history and tragedy. As she finished the final words of the spell, a bright light filled the hall, blinding Elizabeth and Lady Arabella's ghost. When the light faded, the ghost was gone, leaving behind only a faint echo of her presence. Elizabeth stood there for a moment, catching her breath and processing what had just happened. She felt a sense of relief that Lady Arabella's ghost had been put to rest, but also a sense of sadness for the tragic fate that had befallen her. She turned and walked out of the mansion, the weight of the past heavy on her shoulders. She knew that the events of the past would continue to haunt her, but she also knew that she had done what she could to make things right. As she walked away from the mansion, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and wonder at the power of the supernatural. She knew that there were still mysteries in the world that were beyond human understanding, and that sometimes, the only way to confront them was to face them head-on.